Welcome back. In this session, we are going to learn about control flow activities. So let's get started. So in the last session, we created this pipeline which is truly generic, which would take in a source URL and a sink file name and copies the data from source URL to the sink, which was great. But what we found is we needed to create 4 triggers in order to copy 4 datasets. Wouldn't it be nicer if we can have the pipeline, get the information about the sources and sinks from somewhere and then copies all the data required and we can invoke the pipeline with one trigger? It is possible. That's where Data Factory provides us with an activity called lookup which you can use to get the information from a data source which is supported by Azure. And then you can use another activity called ForEach which will let you go through the list of file names or list of items you've got within the file and then invoke the copy activity. Or any other activity for that matter. So, let's look at each one of those. So you've got the lookup activity. Lookup activity basically can retrieve a dataset from an Azure Data Factory supported data source. And it is used to dynamically determine which objects to operate, which is a typical use case for us in this scenario. And the supported data stores are very similar to what you got in your copy data activity. So, it supports most of the data sources which we've already seen. So that'll be like blob storage, data lakes Gen 2 and databases like Azure SQL Database and SQL Server and DB2 and all of those. So there's a wide variety of supported databases. And the ForEach activity can then get the information from the lookup activity and go through each of the items in the output from the lookup activity and then invoke other activities. So, what we need basically, in order for the lookup to pick up the file names, so we got the source URL and this sink file name from somewhere, is to have a file or a database table which keeps that information. So the easiest way to do that is to put it into a file as a JSON object and then you can get the information from there. So I've created a JSON file which contains the information we need. Let me show you how that looks. So this is my JSON file, ECDC file lists for dynamic pipeline.json. We're just going to deal with 2 files to start with. And it's an array. Within that I've got the source URL and the sink file name for the first set of files here. And then on the second occurrence I've got the hospital admissions file. So we can use a lookup activity to read this information. It'll read, and then we can get the ForEach activity to just iterate over this list. So it'll go over the first list first and then it'll go over the second one. And for each one of those we can call the copy activity. So let's upload this file into an Azure Blob Storage so that the Data Factory can read from there. And then we can go and develop the solution in Data Factory. Let me switch over to the Azure Storage Explorer and this is my Blob Storage account. And I'm going to create a new blob container. I'm going to call that as configs. And I'm going to upload the file. And that was the ECDC file lists for dynamic pipeline.json. And if I upload that, that's done. And in the meantime, let's switch over to the Data Factory. And the first thing we need to do is we need to create a dataset which points to that file we just uploaded. So let me click on there, click Create New Dataset, and then this is going to be a blob storage dataset. And the file was going to be a JSON file. Click Continue. And then let's call this one as DSECDC file list dynamic. And the link services will be the blob storage link service, which we created already. And we need a file path. You can click here and then this is the configs. We put the file under there and the name of the file is this. So let's click on that one and let's import the schema and then click OK. Okay, so that dataset's now been created. Now we need to access the dataset from a lookup activity. So before we put the lookup activity into the main pipeline, I'm going to create a test pipeline and show you how the lookup activity and the ForEach statement work and then we can plug it into here. This is mainly because if I put the lookup activity into the main pipeline, then we'll have to run the copy activity every time we come to debug something. So I'm going to call this pipeline as test and let's get the lookup activity that'll be under general and bring in the lookup activity. And we don't need to worry about the names because we're going to delete this pipeline in a minute. And click on Settings. You'll have to pick the dataset, which is the DSECDC file list. And the one thing you need to be careful about is this one. First row only. So you can ask a lookup activity to give you just the first record or everything within the file. In our case, we want everything within the file. So we need to untick that. So that is basically the lookup activity done. Let's debug this. Okay, so that's succeeded, and let's have a look at the outputs. So that is, I'll go back and show you. So that is the right arrow here, and that's what is the outputs. As you can see here, it says, actually we had 2 records. So, count equals 2, and then the value is the section of our data. So it's brought back this JSON record in here. So one thing to remember is whenever we need to access the output from the lookup activity, we need to access this object. So we will be going with output.value.sourceRelativeURL to get the URL here. So I'll show you how that's done. So the next thing we want to do is to use the ForEach activity that will be under iterations and conditions. So ForEach activity is basically very similar to a for loop within any other programming language. So it takes in a set of values and then it writes over and do what you want it to do. So let's make the ForEach dependent on the lookup. So let's drag that in here. And now, within the ForEach activity and settings, you've got a few options. So when you get in multiple values from the lookup, ForEach is going to iterate over all of them. So you can ask for each to iterate over them sequentially. So the first record first and then the second one, or you can do them in parallel. So let's pick sequential for now, and then we need to specify the item on which we want it to iterate over. So in our case, that was the value item, if you remember. So let's click on the Add Dynamic Content, and then you will see the output from the previous activity. So that is from the lookup. So that is the activity, lookup.output.value. So that's all we need to do here. And then if you click OK, the lookup's basically configured, but within the lookup we want to do something so that we can see the outputs. So in order to just test it, let's create a variable. So let's call that a sourceRelativeURL. So that is the value we are going to set, and then see whether that is really being done by the ForEach. So let's click on the ForEach activity and then click on Activities. And for each of the iterations we want to invoke a set variable activity. All that does is just set the value for the variable. So in here, come over to the variables and then pick the variable we want to set. We only have that one we just created, and then we want to set the value. In this case, we want to set the value to be the output from the ForEach, and we want to set the sourceRelativeURL. So that is what we had within our data, if you remember. So let me show you quickly. So we had the sourceRelativeURL. So what I would expect to be printed is that value first and then that value next. So let's do a debug and see what's happening. So click on Debug. Okay. So as you can see, the lookup's completed, it's brought back to the 2 records, and the ForEach ran, and the ForEach has invoked the set variable twice as we expected. And the value of the variable is set to the national case death first, and then on the next iteration it would have set it to the hospital ICU admission rates. So this is how the lookup activity and the ForEach activity works. So what we are going to do is we are going to plug in the lookup activity and the ForEach activity in our main pipeline. And then invoke the copy activity within the ForEach activity so that it takes the URL and the sync file name and the new system in the copy activity. That's the end of this session. But before we finish, let's discard the changes to this test pipeline, which we don't need. And let's publish the changes to the dataset we've created. So click Publish, and that should finish in the next few seconds. I'll see you in the next session.